make-believe. The military has seen the so-called quantum stealth technology. It works by bending the light around an object, even concealing most of a person's shadow. Imagine what that could do for a sniper hiding in a field.
Very similar to what they carry with a survival blanket, throw it over top of them. And unless you walked right into them, you wouldn't know that they were there.
So what was once firmly in the world of make-believe could quickly become quite real.
The science is in the special fabric, so you don't need a power source or some instruction manual to make it work. Theoretically, any soldier, even in the most remote location, could quickly put it on and get it working.
Was a schoolboy privileged to study the Bible in its original language, Hebrew. We reach the story of the great flood in the book of Genesis, where it stated that it was at that time that the Nephilim were upon the earth. I raised my hand and pointed out that word literally meant those who have descended, who have come down from the heavens to earth. For that, instead of being complimented, I was reprimanded. "You don't question the Bible," the teacher roared. I can still feel the hurting. It caused me to become persistent in looking for the answer to the enigma of the Nephilim. To whom was the Bible referring? And why does the next verse in Genesis refer to them as sons, plural, and as gods, plural? An aberration in a Bible devoted to monotheism. A clue in a 19th century commentary led me to seek the answer in the mythologies of the ancient peoples. There has been the many gods. From Greece, I traced them back across the Mediterranean Sea to the ancient Near East. The myths of the Egyptians and Assyrians, Babylonians and Hittites and Canaanites seem to tell the same tales, only calling the same pantheons by different names. In the end, I discovered that all those myths, and thus the enigmatic verses in the Bible about the Nephilim, had a common earlier source. Tales of gods and men first written down on clay tablets by a people called Sumerians. In the 1970s, Mr. Sitchin's lifelong interest in the archaeology of the Middle East culminated in a book, The 12th Planet, published in 1976. As Mr. Sitchin recounted, he had studied and studied, traveled and traveled, and talked, until one day his wife Rena said, "Isn't it time, Zechariah, that you stop talking about this subject and start writing?" Mr. Sitchin went on to explain that when he began work on the 12th Planet, he thought it would be his only book. But as we now know, he ended up writing a total of 15. The 12th Planet appeared at the height of the ancient astronaut controversy that had been generated by claims of Erich von Daniken that he had discovered evidence of the presence of UFOs and extraterrestrials in the artifacts from various ancient cultures. While von Daniken may get much of the credit for originating the ancient astronaut theory with his book Chariots of the Gods, it was not really his theory. Some scholars argue that in the works of Helena Blavatsky we find the first modern version of the ancient astronaut theory. Blavatsky postulated the possibility of life on other worlds and that the ancients were already aware of the advanced extraterrestrial creatures. She argued that these creatures had visited the Earth and aided the evolution of humanity. Indeed, several decades before von Daniken wrote his book in 1968, the premise of the theory had been formed by several researchers and writers. Von Daniken's approach was, however, somewhat novel in that it centered upon pictures from ancient sites that could be seen as resembling contemporary astronauts and objects similar to items reported as unidentified flying objects. Mr. Sitchin started with a somewhat different hypothesis, that ancient mythology should be read as historical documents, as reports of actual occurrences. As we mentioned earlier, his starting point was the biblical book of Genesis, chapter 6, and the cryptic references to the sons of God marrying the daughters of men, and the giants or Nephilim who were on earth in the era prior to the biblical flood. Using a variety of ancient documents, including the Babylonian epic known as the Enuma Elish, he hypothesized the existence of another planet in our solar system, which he named Nibiru, that travels an elliptical orbit that brings it into the area between the orbits of Jupiter and Mars every 3,600 years. The planet is inhabited by a humanoid race called the Anunnaki, who created Homo sapiens. So, in other words, Zecharia Sitchin relied on actual historical text and references to formulate his hypothesis. The Anunnaki paradigm, or the Sitchin paradigm if you will, draws from references that were discovered only about 170 years ago and later. And while his research irritates academics and religious folks alike, it does not necessarily refute either, which is ironic when you consider that his most vocal critics are members of those two camps.
Heads and wonder what is happening in this small town in India. Electricity was shut down not only in the temple area but in the entire town of Puri. Why? Because Krishna's heart was being removed from the main idol of Jagannath's temple and was being placed in another idol. No, I don't mean Krishna's heart in a spiritual or mystical way. I mean it physically. Krishna's actual heart is preserved there. But how can a heart be preserved in original condition for 5,000 years? Because it's a very advanced ancient device. It's not made of flesh and muscle. And people say it can generate power. It starts to vibrate if exposed to light, not just sunlight, any form of light. This is why electricity was shut down in the entire town. The people who touched this heart had to wear thick, heavy gloves, and they also had to wear blindfolds to make sure they do not lay eyes on it. Of course, all this sounds strange, but it is true, and we may be looking at evidence of very advanced ancient technology. First, let's look at Krishna's death, which is a mystery by itself. Today, many people do not know about Krishna's death, but ancient sources clearly record his death. Around 3102 BC, roughly 5,000 years ago, Krishna was killed by a hunter in a forest. This was an accident because the hunter was trying to kill a deer. Krishna dies and his body was cremated. It was ritually burnt. But even though Krishna's body was burnt, his heart did not burn at all. It looked like a lump of solid metal with no damage. When the hunter picked up this heart, it vibrated. It was not made of flesh and blood. It was made of a strange artificial material. And I suspect this is some type of electrical device.
surprising discovery was made in the jungle of Ecuador, in what is known as La Cueva de los Tellos, in a town called Mana. This event shook the world of archaeology. More than 300 pieces were found. The most flaming of all was an Illuminati pyramid equal to the dollar bill of a very old dating from an unknown culture. It is said that they may have belonged to Atlantis or Lemuria. The pyramid represents the symbol of the illuminated Bavarian of the 18th century and modern Masons, but this object has the same characteristics as the Illuminati symbol. Even today, these enigmatic stones and objects represent a puzzle for science and archaeology. They are not similar to the indigenous cultures of Ecuador or any other country in Latin America. The stones of Ica have nothing to do with this finding, although at first it may seem that they have similarity. Rather, they seem to have some correlation with the ancient Egyptians, but these were more than 11,000 kilometers away. The collection belongs to guards these pieces. The writings on the pieces resemble a type of Sanskrit, which is the origin of the languages. You can also observe a mathematical reading. A group of gold prospectors led by engineer Elias Sotomayor, who had explored the jungles of La Mana, Ecuador, discovered in an area where it was appreciated that the land had been exploited by mechanical means for the mining extraction, in the coordinates 0.95 degrees south 79.18 west. There he found a deep tunnel that led to a huge chamber where he came across these artifacts. These pieces seem to have been designed respecting a psychoacoustic geometry, having also magnetic effects of 0.0. And its lithic technology and finishing challenge again the history books and the dates of the first civilizations. They have a similarity to features of the Mayan culture but also present designs reminiscent of the ancient civilizations of Southeast Asia. Likewise, its graphic forms have a feasible comparison with Sanskrit, being able to date these from the time when only one civilization inhabited the planet, but a technologically advanced and culturally developed civilization on a global level. This could mean that in ancient times, there would be a connection between all the ancient civilizations, which would also imply that they were technologically advanced civilizations, which would change our historical concept completely. One of the most surprising features of this finding is the use of calcite in the pieces. Calcite has fluorescent properties that are activated by ultraviolet light. For certain symbols or graphics would go almost unnoticed by the naked eye. But when exposing these pieces to ultraviolet light, certain graphics acquire all the prominence for their light effect. It is as if it were a code, a secret message carved thousands of years ago. The objects of different sizes, and there are discs carved to the detail with geometric mandalas and concentric and eccentric circles, plates with spirals and engravings. In some you can recognize constellations like Orion or the Pleiades, 13 cups of jadeite of different sizes with patterns that are similar to those of the Mayan culture, or contemporary Western mystical ideas, humanoid figures in ritual attitudes, snake heads, etc. A map has also been found engraved. The map represents a very old epoch, in which the geographical structure of our planet was different and had not yet given rise to the natural catastrophes reported by all the ancient texts that, among other things, detailed the rise in sea level, but the current continents are distinguishable, while in the coastal area of Southeast Asia there is a delineated land mass that is currently underwater, and in the Americas the islands of the Caribbean and the Florida Peninsula do not appear, and in their place once more reveals huge land masses that today would be submerged. In the middle of the North Atlantic appears a great island that coincides with the Atlantis of Plato. In the Pacific, below the equatorial line, a continent now non-existent, and south of what is now Japan, a third continental mass, which coincides with the Yonaguni underwater finds, is also represented. Another enigma of the map is that between the region where the ancient Babylon was and the site in La Mana where the objects were found, a white line has been drawn that unites them. With respect to the pyramid, as there have not been discoveries to date that prove the existence of pyramids like the Egyptian ones in America, it has been considered a representation of the Great Pyramid of Giza, although strange because of the distance of both terrestrial areas separated by thousands of kilometers. But many mysteries are still buried in the jungles of Ecuador. It is gray, with small incrustations in gold at its feet that represent the constellation of Orion, and other glyphs with indecipherable characters. A German professor who is president of the Linguistic Society of that country, Kurt Childman, said that he could translate this cryptic text as, "The Creator's Son is on the street." All the stones of La Manna reacted under the ultraviolet light, some forming numerous constellations that shone as if they were stars in the firmament, but in the case of the pyramid, their eye begins to emit its own light originating blue flashes. These flashes have an engraving and the letters that appear, very similar to the text of the manuscript Voynich not yet deciphered and with the writing of the island of Easter, are of the pre-Sanskrit, reason why they would be older than the first known writing. Currently, the stones of La Manna are part of the private collection that